Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's gathering, which is the Fall Emeriti Lecture with Diane Gifford-Gonzalez, who's a distinguished research professor emerita of anthropology at UC Santa Cruz. I'm Eli Silver. I'm president of the Emeriti Association. And this lecture happens twice a year. It's in collaboration between the Emeriti Association and the Chancellor's Office. And the function of the lectures is to highlight Emeriti activities because many Emeriti continue to make contributions in the areas of research, teaching, philanthropy, and community involvement. And in fact, when you look at all the Emeriti through the UC system, the amount of the contribution is equivalent to an 11th UC campus. Tonight's lecture is entitled, Kicking the Prow, Reflections on a Life in Conversation with Past and Present People and Other Creatures. After the talk, there will be time for questions. I'd like to thank Chancellor LaRive for supporting this series, and the lecture will be recorded and made available on the Emeriti Association's YouTube channel after the event. So at this time, I'd like to invite Cameron Monroe, who's the chair of anthropology at UC Santa Cruz, to introduce the speaker.
Thank you, Eli. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Good evening. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Emerita Diane Gifford-Gonzalez. Actually, I'll leave this down. Many of us know Diane as both a distinguished scholar and a beloved colleague here at UC Santa Cruz. She probably doesn't remember, but I first met Diane in 2002 when she was visiting the UCLA Kotzen Institute for a quick trip to the zooarchaeology lab where I was a graduate student. She mentioned that a job would be coming up the next year at UC Santa Cruz, and I might think about applying given my interests in West African archaeology. Inspired by these words of encouragement from the great Diane Gifford-Gonzalez, and not really understanding how things work here at UC Santa Cruz, I busted my hump to finish my dissertation the following year. The job did eventually appear 4 years later, and I've been lucky enough to call myself her colleague and her friend for the past 20 years. Diane is widely recognized as a pioneer in zooarchaeology, the study of animal remains from archaeological sites. Her research has illuminated everything from subsistence strategies and the domestication of animals to long-term relationships between human societies and the environments they have shaped. She has worked across continents and time periods, from early Holocene Africa to the post-context American Southwest to the coast of California, always combining meticulous analysis with innovative methods to answer key anthropological questions. Her leadership in the field has been recognized at the very highest levels. She's been elected to both the National Academy of Sciences and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, honors that few scholars ever attain, and a testament to the scholarly depth and widespread impact of her work. But here at UC Santa Cruz, her legacy is perhaps even more tangible. Diane played a key role in building archaeology in the anthropology department on this campus, helping to shape it into the vibrant and respected program that it is today. She has been a tireless mentor, not only to graduate students, but also to countless undergrads who found in her both a rigorous teacher and an enthusiastic supporter. Many of those students have gone on to distinguished careers, carrying forward the intellectual curiosity and high standards that Diane instilled in them. Beyond her scholarship and teaching, Diane has been a generous leader in professional societies, a champion for inclusivity in the discipline, and a model of collaborative research with indigenous communities here in California. She has shown that archaeology is not only about interpreting the past, but also about engaging ethically and responsibly in the present. We are truly fortunate to have her with us today, and I know that we will all benefit from the insights she brings. Please join me in welcoming Professor Emeritus Diane Gifford-Gonzalez.
Wow, I wish I knew that person. Looking at this group of creative and dedicated people, quite a few of whom I believe are smarter than I am, I'm honored that you came this evening. Thank you. First, I want to acknowledge that we are meeting on the unceded lands of the Yupi tribe of the Awaswa-speaking nation, whose lands and interests today are looked after by the Amamutsin tribal band, descendants of the people taken into mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista. Today, the Amamutsin are working to care for the earth and all living things through relearning efforts and the activities of the Amamutsin Land Trust, which I strongly recommend you check out online. Second, and up front, I want to thank the people responsible for producing tonight's event. Christy Dolly, an expert wrangler of cranky or squirrely. Oops, sorry, I went to the wrong slide, but we might as well, after Cameron's introduction, say that this is pretty much summing up where I'm coming from, folks. I love this. The minute I heard this, I thought, yeah, okay, that's me. Hardest working person in the National Academy of Sciences. All right, let me go back to the first slide so I don't forget anybody here. Emeriti Association president and one of my longest term friends in Santa Cruz, Eli Silver. Noticed I didn't say oldest friend in Santa Cruz. Cameron Monroe for his gracious introduction. The folks who make this event run smoothly from the parking lot to the refreshments table. And the unsung heroes, the audiovisual crew, John Redke and Dave Morrison. Thank you all in advance for your help. So now we've already been through the second slide, and we'll go on to the third. If I can get it to work. Interesting. Okay. So here's a heads up, folks. I am not going to discuss my most recent project, which is still very much in the works, right away, but instead I believe I need to go back to the outset and discuss how my trajectory as a scholar has brought me to my present research, which braids together two strands of long-term concern. The practice of zooarchaeology, as Cameron said, using animal remains from archaeological sites to discuss what my humanities colleagues have felicitously called multi-species relations, and a concern with present-day people with whom I've worked. So, like any good archaeologist, I'm going to recount some history. My intellectual career has not proceeded in a straight line. Far from it. I wasn't one of those people who always wanted to be an archaeologist. As I bounced around among 3 undergraduate majors, art history, Near Eastern Studies, and Anthropology at UC Berkeley, and then around several areas of anthropology with paleontology and animal behavioral studies thrown in, I've put myself into a variety of conceptual situations. And in doing so, I've repeatedly found myself having a sense of standing on multiple moving plates, in the sense of tectonic plates, where one discipline's conceptual framework concatenated with and or conflicted with that of another in fields espoused by people who all seem pretty reasonable to me. Maybe because I had repeatedly to suss out playground politics during my army brat peregrinations, I'm cursed with trying to explore what's creating the tensions underlying a situation and to give a name to these, at least in my own head. I think this fixation has been the starting point that led to the writings that I believe are my strongest contributions to my field. And it's probably, however, best to have a look at varieties of archaeological writing, which is a genre all of its own. The other thing that I will say is a lot of you barely heard of me unless we served on committees together. And that is because the stuff I've been writing about is pretty esoteric, and it was meant for archaeologists rather than for the general public. I was reminded when I was thinking about this of a line out of an old Phil Oakes song. And I'm sure it wouldn't interest anybody except a small circle of friends. And it's interested a small circle of archaeologists. If there's time, I would also share some creative works which have been my refuge and restorative in my life. But let's look at those forms of archaeological writing. Now, there's a simple site report, reporting on what you found, the dates, ideas about relationships with other sites, usually a journal article unless you've been excavating Jericho or some other enormous site. Then there's regional synthesis of related sites that have been reported in the local literature, all hanging together and drawing generalizations about some point in time and space, as testified to by these. So this could be an article, a monograph, co-authored or single-authored. And then there's, at another level, discussions of processes of change over time in one region, or comparisons of trajectories over time towards similar end states in different geographic regions. And it may discuss anything from intra- and extra-regional trade, imperialist impacts and local responses, religious conversions, and what came from that. It may offer new perspectives on these issues in the field in general, and sort of sneakily criticize those that came before. These could be articles, books, single author, multiple authors. And then there's works that deal with the problems of archaeological knowledge and inference. It may use archaeological cases to illustrate a conceptual point, but it's really about theory and method. These are major articles or books, single-authored or co-authored. I've written in all of these categories, but it's the last that's the hardest one, at least for me, and it's the one that I've spent a lot of my energy doing. Talking with an archaeologist friend about such articles, I said, it's like pulling your own teeth. And she agreed, but then said, it's like wrestling with an angel when you don't believe in God. Now, she's Italian, so this may resonate more strongly for her than for many in this room. This talk's supposed to be about current research, but I must acknowledge my ancestors, biological, cultural, and intellectual. Given my fascination from an early age with animals and curiosity about things I found in the ground, these are pictures that mainly taken by my father, I was probably destined to be either a paleontologist or a zooarchaeologist, except when I was little, that field didn't exist. When my father returned from World War II, we lived in rural northern New Jersey, and he commuted by a long bus ride to teach high school in East Orange. My parents were self-defined naturalists who shared a deep knowledge of plants and animals, earth history, evolution, and in my father's case, a devotion to dinosaurs. Despite their book learning, my parents were remarkable for their lack of self-distancing from plants and animals. They both talked to the plants they grew and cared for animals as relatives. I was a sickly child with ailments that I keep doing this, we now know are typical of children of smokers, as my parents were. And to pass the time I spent in bed, my mother gave me hand-me-down National Geographics well before I could read. Some portrayed ancient Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Celts, and I loved poring over the information that they conveyed and looking at the details, but I never grasped that we got this information via archaeology. A 12-year-old neighbor girl was the closest to me in age, and she babysat 3 to 5-year-old me, duping me into doing her chores, most memorably getting eggs out from under hostile hens 2/3 of my size. I had no playmates, but I never felt lonely, surrounded by these many wonders. With the Korean War in 1951, the Army called my father back for his particular skill set. And this formative world ended, and our peregrination started. I attended 18 schools in 13 years, many in the Jim Crow South. But my parents took me to national parks, bent on continuing to expose me to the wonders of the non-human world. My undergraduate studies at UC Berkeley primarily, ultimately, focused on primate behavior and evolution, and I was admitted to the graduate program in that track there in 1967. But by spring 1968, I'd had enough of militarized police actions and a less than functional grad track, and I withdrew only a few weeks before the police murdered James Rector in People's Park. I sought sanity from friends who were studying acorn woodpecker behavior in Carmel Valley, and with an old undergraduate chum who'd wound up working on the UC Santa Cruz campus, which was quite new at the time. My return to graduate studies in archaeology at UCB in 1970 owed much to the agency of Glenn Isaac, with whom I'd taken an undergrad honors seminar in 1967. He was the first person to make archaeology truly interesting to me. The archaeology program at UCB then had 2 strongly separated tracks: Americanist archaeology and the Old World prehistory track that I chose. All my mentors, Isaac, a South African exile, Robert Rodden, an American, and Desmond Clark, English to the core, were educated at the University of Cambridge. Now, from the 1930s to the 1970s, Cambridge espoused a man-learned relationship theme, seeing plant and animal evidence as important archaeological data when few other universities anywhere in the world did. When I proposed building on my primate and human osteology training to analyze archaeological faunas, my mentors readily agreed. I also took paleontology courses from Bill Clemens and Joe Gregory, both great people, and in sedimentology from Dick Hay, famous for his paleo-environmental analyses and reconstructions at Olduvai Gorge. Here I need to backtrack to 1969 for a moment, the year before I re-entered grad school when I was living in the Bay Area, to offer some background on why I chose not to do archaeology in the USA. That year, I'd become aware of the indigenous critique of Americanist archaeology as a colonial enterprise. I'd also studied the then available books in my youth on colonial histories of Eastern Native tribes, and on arriving in California was horrified to read about this state's deliberate program of genocide in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Vine Deloria Jr. published Custer Died for Your Sins in 1989, in which he singled out anthropologists and archaeologists as exploiters of the indigenous living and their dead. I was also galvanized by the native takeover of Alcatraz in November 1969, and financially supported those occupiers to the extent I could as a poor student. I knew whose side I was on, but I had a lot to ponder about my upcoming career choice. wanting me to get some archaeological excavation experience before doing my dissertation fieldwork, my mentors recommended that I join the 1971 UCB Archaeological Field School at Hidden Cave near Fallon, Nevada, run by one of Professor Robert Heiser's graduate students. There, the incident that led me to opt out of American archaeology took place. One day, we went to the beautiful Stillwater Marshes, now a wildlife reserve, where I watched in speechless rage as our field school director tried to bully a young Paiute man whom he'd hired to show him around the marshes into revealing the location of ancestral burials. Speaking out of the corner of his mouth to us girls, he said he'd just have to get tough with the kid to find the good stuff. As 6 of us, including the young Paiute man, bounced along in the bed of the director's pickup truck towards the next location, one young woman burst out to the native man, "Don't tell him anything," and we all joined in. Whoops. I'm sorry, I'm really having... Yeah, I'm not used to not using a mouse with my computer, so please be patient. This was everything Vine Deloria said it was, and I decided right then I could not be an archaeologist in the United States of America until such issues of race and power between white archaeologists and Native people whose histories they purported to address had been dealt with somehow. This was a relatively easy decision for somebody who was either Europe or Africa bound, but the experience stayed with me like a splinter under the skin. My only comfort at that point was that there were a number of other people in my generation who obviously thought this was outrageous too. Now we go to the next slide. In 1972, I'd joined Glenn in excavating some million-year-old sites east of Lake Turkana, Kenya. He suggested, because I wanted to study the present to better elucidate past evidence that we had, that I try ethno-archaeological research with the local Dasanet people, an agro-pastoral group living along the Kenya, Ethiopia, and Sudan borders, with whom fossil hunters Richard Leakey and Kamoya Camus, both now passed to the ancestors, had established good relations. The Dasanets were infamous, or maybe famous, for refusing to surrender their guns to the British and then to the Kenyan government, and were subjected to a savage cordon sanitaire policy that was still in effect when I started my field work. Now, ethnoarchaeology is a term that we use for going and hanging out with people, doing an ethnography, but with an archaeologist's eye toward the material outcomes of their behavior. And I decided, after trying a few other options and being advised against some things by somebody who tried them and found they didn't work, to opt for research. So in 73 and 74, I started one of 3 field seasons researching with the Dasanet. And Glenn and Richard allowed me to use tents and other field gear, plus an old Land Rover with very bald tires, as long as I used them outside their own summer field season. My field work then thus took place during what would have been 2 rainy seasons, but the region was experiencing a 6-year drought, so they foresaw no complications. Glenn chose 2 assistants who had worked for him, Andrew and Jack Kilonso, who were not close relatives, men from the Akamba ethnic group from south of Nairobi, whom he judged to have good people skills and also good attitudes toward the local people. We hired the only local man willing to work for wages, a poor herder named Luriano Kesia, to be our cook and camp assistant. I'd originally planned to document the diet of the Dasanich at the main settlement of Ileret and other camps, and to study its material fallout, especially the animal bones. But on arrival, I realized that the drought had taken its toll on people and herds, and because of the Dasanich obstinacy about their firearms, and they were being raided by people from across the Ethiopian border in a very murderous way, so they had their reasons for keeping their guns, except they also raided in the opposite direction. The government did not permit NGOs to give them any food aid. People were not dying of hunger outright, but in a settlement of nearly 300 mostly young people, there was only one pregnancy and only a few babies. The boys of 7 to 10 years of age who cared for sheep and goats in outlying camps with scanty provisions from home looked outright malnourished. I could not bring myself to interview hungry people about their diets before going home to my lunch. I faced the choice of either giving away all my food in one day and going home, or finding some other research tactic acceptable to the Dasanich and to me. Now, I noticed from aerial photographs and from being on the ground many abandoned settlements with their thorn branch fences still preserved in the dry landscape. I gleaned approximate dates for their occupation by talking to the people of Ileret, finding that they spanned about 30 years of local history. So I sampled bones lying on the surface and shallowly buried in sediments from 12 such sites spanning that time range, as well as from some camps that I actually saw created while in the field by the poorest of the poor who had to forage along the lakeshore for fishes, reptiles like crocodiles and turtles, and were hoping to find a hippo one of these days. What I was doing was called site formation studies, and it was just starting in archaeology. Let me unpack this photo just a little bit. In the middle, you see an inhabited and an abandoned defensive Dasanich settlement. In the inhabited one, you see the houses, which belonged to and were constructed by women, in the center, and surrounding them in overlapping petals were goat pens, calf pens, and on the outside, cow and donkey pens. The reasoning was that if either raiders or hyenas or lions came, the donkeys and the cows would set up enough of a bellowing that the men would be alerted and come out with their spears and guns. And this is the bottommost of these pictures is a picture of household debris thrown daily by house cleaning women into the goat pens. And I was finding very similar patterns when I got, sorry about that, when I got down to look at the same kind of deposit in these abandoned camps. Now, I'm having trouble changing the slide. As fate would have it, the drought broke during my second field season in April 1974, affording the chance to study sedimentation at a short-term camp we'd actually documented earlier but left all the bones in place. In August of the same year, paleontologist, sedimentologist Kay Berensmeyer, Andrew, Jack, and I excavated the camp and were able to closely document the depositional events, which Kay and I later published on. Other experience changed me as a person and an academic. I went into the field thinking I knew all about pastoralist patriarchy, and it was there, but it was Dasanich women who taught me how to be tough and situationally assertive despite the odds. And one teenage girl's shouted questions, "Are you a woman or a girl?" led me to understand that age was a plane of status equal to gender to them. One group of those stock camp boys started to gather at our little camp in the bush every day, watching us eat our lunch of curried bully beef and maize meal that Loriano prepared. It was soul-searing, but a prior conversation with a Dasanach elder had established that if we were to give away all of our food, no one would feel in the least bit obligated to give us anything, much less food in return. Given this, I told Loriano that I would never feed anybody who just showed up at camp, unless I'd specifically invited them to eat with us, but that he could dispose of the lunch leftovers as he saw fit. I knew he'd worked for some of the more affluent herders in exchange for a few animals, much the same as you find in tales in the Torah or Old Testament about, was it Isaac working, for somebody for 7 years to get so many sheep and so forth. So I figured if he was provisioning any sons of those men in the stock camp, it would enhance his status. I never inquired further. I finished my research at Lake Turkana firmly convinced that I lacked the temperament for making a career out of ethnoarchaeology, especially among people so marginalized and outright endangered by global history and politics. And I can go on, but I won't. The Marines also offered my assistant and me ample opportunities to contemplate our Land Rover and ourselves as potential sedimentary particles while digging out of several floodplains. But if I was not cut out to do ethnoarchaeology, I did respect and admire the Dasanich and also the Maasai pastoralists with whom I spent a shorter time south of Nairobi. And I already had a sense of what I could do to document the history of herding people in East Africa. Between the intervals when I could do my fieldwork at Lake Turkana and to cover the cost of my airfare and expenses in Nairobi, I analyzed a large faunal collection excavated by one of Glenn's students in 1969-70 from a site about 40 miles northwest of Nairobi. Based on the presence of pottery alone, people had classified the site as, quote, pastoral Neolithic. Whoops. Okay. But nobody had identified thousands of animal bones from the site to see if any domestic animals were indeed present. I was among the first two people to document the earliest herders of cattle, sheep, goats, and donkeys in East Africa. We published on the site in 1981. Now, looking around me in the National Museum, I realized there are about 20 other unanalyzed faunal collections dating to the same time span and all essentially abandoned without any treatment at all. My experiences with Dasanich women and men gave me an appreciation of the challenges and agencies of real livestock managers, which I thought would enrich my research on these as yet unanalyzed faunal collections. So over the next 20 years, I returned 6 times with the permission of the museum and the Kenyan government to analyze 18 more of these early pastoralist faunas, publishing many of these in those less challenging forms of articles. But hold on, you say, you're 11 slides into your talk and you haven't explained the kicking the Prow business yet. Okay, this began when I was hired at UCSC in 1976 to be the only archaeologist in my department. This campus, as we all know, is lovely, and contemplation of the sequoias, oaks, manzanitas, California lilacs, the meadows, the deer matrilines, raccoon families, occasional annoyed bobcats, how do I know? It's that tail, articulate raven pairs, and traces of the lords and ladies of the forest, the puma, repeatedly saved my sanity. But I was the only anthropological archaeologist at UCSC for 13 years. My geographically nearest colleague at Stanford was in much the same situation and could offer little encouragement. As most UCSC departments in anthropology had no graduate program. And without the chance to try out new ideas in graduate seminars, I'm sorry, have I already, something really weird is going on. No, never mind. It's telling me I've talked for 89 minutes. Even an archaeologist knows this amount of time is wrong. Okay, so I can't look at that. All right. There was no graduate program, so no graduate seminars to try out new ideas. So I was pretty much on my own and thinking things through. I did keep up a lively exchange of letters with colleagues in the first generation of zooarchaeologists, of which I'm one, comparing methods and circulating article drafts for comment. But it was still a lonely process. A year after I was hired, I also learned that my predecessor had accumulated local artifacts and ancestral remains. Wondering if the Creator were treating my self-righteous decision to distance myself from American archaeology with a dose of Indian humor, I committed to caring for these remains and exploring ways to repatriate them. I started running hands-on labs as an overload class, so I'm up to 6 courses a year, to get basic reports on the inherited artifacts to our regional archaeological data center, letting the ancestral remains rest undisturbed for the time. Given all this, I wondered if my scholarly output would be enough to pass tenure review. Back then, big excavation team projects were the most prestigious archaeological activities, and I could not pull one off. In fact, in Kenya, I was analyzing the fallout of others, better supported archaeologists' failures to cover and complete such projects. I understood my laboratory analysis would not be assessed on equal footing with field projects. So how best to use my time? A single conversation in 1977, in no way related to archaeology, gave me a new perspective. One Sunday, while visiting friends in Berkeley, my car broke down and I circled back to a friend's old apartment house. She asked a neighbor with a degree in philosophy, but now making a living repairing cars, to diagnose the problem. It was a blown head gasket, which he could fix for a reasonable price, but had to wait till Monday to buy parts. So we, in the meantime, sat down in my friend's living room, sipping beers and smoking a substance that now is completely legal for recreational use in California. As was typical of our generation back then, we commented on how powerless we felt. After the horrors of the Vietnam War, the Greensboro and Kent State massacres, the FBI's assassination of campaign against Black Panthers, Watergate, and so on, what really could one person actually do? But the philosopher and mechanic told us he believed there was small cause for hope. He recounted the story that one afternoon, a few years back, he was on a pier in San Francisco, and a huge luxury yacht was approaching it. But the yacht's angle of approach was too acute, and the prow was going to crash into the pier, damaging both the yacht and the pier. Everyone on the dock saw the inevitable disaster and was edging away when a burly old guy, probably a retired stevedore, marched to the edge of the pier and sat down, wrapping an arm around a mooring post and dangling his legs off the side of the pier. Everybody was even more horrified because now, in addition to the dock being crushed, the yacht would crush the old guy sitting there. But immediately before the collision, the old guy pulled his legs back and with precise timing kicked the approaching prow of the yacht hard with both feet. The yacht's prow instantly pivoted just a bit away from the dock, and the yacht came to rest in perfect alignment with the pier. So I'm sorry, I'm having some trouble again with my mouse here. The philosopher mechanic basically said, He thought that someone could make a difference if they understood the course of some set of events and knew where and how to exert some force. Now, I came home driving my repaired car, thinking a lot about the old guy in the yacht, and I wondered whether I could intervene and influence the direction of debates and work that other better funded archaeologists were doing. Could I kick the archaeology's metaphorical prow? What I didn't realize at the time was that kicking the prow demands all your resources, everything you've got. In 1969, I got a chance to do this when the editor of the annual Advances in Archaeological Method and Theory asked me to write a critical review of taphonomy, which is a paleontological study of how bones get from living animals into the fossil state, and paleoecology for its 1980 volume. I knew his request would force me to grapple head-on with contradictions and tensions over the use of analogy in archaeology, which I alluded to, hopefully amusingly, in a retrospective discussion of how these things were rolling around in my head at the time, and the archaeological record of American antiquity in a while. So I was on leave, so why not try? I went ahead and started in on this, but immediately realized that my work was complicated by the imposter syndrome, which I soon understood had a gender dimension. But the first version of my manuscript, see folks, I'm having real problems with this, was, no, go back one, had positive reviews except for one. I'm going to speak extemporaneously, hopefully fast. And that one was written by somebody whose identity I still don't know, but I call the killer. This person, in very tidy, small lettering, politely asked all the key questions about the use of analogy in the historical sciences, including archaeology, that I'd skated over, busted. And in dealing with that, I took a deep dive into philosophy of science and analogical inference. Lucky me. And when I came out of it, 3 or 4 months later, after feeling that disorientation that Thomas Kuhn describes for scientists feeling a paradigm shift, and after going to a women's Gestalt therapy group to work on my anxieties, I put together what I thought was a hard-won but valid structure, which I published a year late in Advances in 1981. And one of the things I discovered in there is that sometimes when I could not find the words for things, if I drew a diagram, a nonverbal process, I could then label it and start discussing the relationships verbally. So it turns out, folks, I am really sorry about this. All the articles that I count as my most influential since then have had at least one diagram. And I've told graduate students that if they see a diagram, they can say, this is an influential part of Gifford-Gonzalez's canon. So over the next 33 years, I published these 5 more prow-kicking paper, each motivated by a sense of those moving plates, intuiting something was being overlooked, plates were grinding uselessly, or that some plates previously far apart could come together harmoniously. Time doesn't permit how those moving plates affected the writing of these articles, but sure enough, here we go. Here are the diagrams. Now, In 1994, I experienced the poorly coordinated and understaffed care in American hospitals that my father was receiving for his lung cancer within our bottom line driven medical system. And I made a major decision. I resolved that for as long as it took both my parents to complete their final journeys, my mother had already been diagnosed with 3 life-threatening cardiopulmonary conditions. I should be no farther away than 6 hours travel to their Salinas suburb home so that I could get back and monitor their medical care. In doing so, I turned away from 2 decades of engagement with East Africa, dear friends, and beloved places. After my father's death in 1994, I turned to those regional fauna collections I've been curating since 1977. And from 1996 to 2007, I worked with isotopic ecologist Paul Koch, exploring whether northern fur seals, which were the most abundant, sorry about this, folks, good at thinking, not so good at doing this kind of stuff. Whether or not these animals that were once so abundant lived, I'm feeling a lot like that annoyed bobcat at present, and it's all my own fault. Okay. They were so historically abundant, but by the time Europeans showed up, they were gone. And there were various ideas about why, but Paul and I did establish through isotopic analysis that the northern fur seals in our collections did live and breed in these latitudes in considerable numbers for something like 1,000 years to 1,500 years. Okay, then almost immediately, Professor Kent Lightfoot, who's won a Lifetime Achievement Award for his, I won't call it kicking the prow, I think Kent somehow got in the wheelhouse. And he's been steering the conversation in archaeology in incredibly influential ways, charting a path for indigenous archaeology and training so many indigenous archaeologists as well as white archaeologists who want to follow that path. He asked me to see whether I would work with their projects on the Central Coast in Santa Cruz, San Mateo, southern San Mateo counties, to look at the use of fire to maintain grasslands in this area in pre-colonial times by the ancestors of the Amamutsan and other groups who now seem to be completely extinct, regrettably. I jumped at the chance because this seemed like somehow a way to make a full circle of my alienation from Americanist archaeology. And the bottom line was that the Amamutsan were present from the beginning as collaborators, and they dictated the terms under which we could work. They, after a lot of soul searching, decided that archaeologists and other scientists could be useful to them in helping them restore the knowledge that had been lost during the colonial period about how their ancestors had done what Creator wanted them to do, which was take care of the land and the living beings in it. So we were able, after about 14 years of work, to show that areas that are now closed were cyclically maintained as grasslands by cyclical burning on a 2 to 3 year rota, and that even the redwood understory was burned on a decadal rota, thereby avoiding the kind of disastrous fires that we've been accustomed to since the Spanish, the Mexicans, and the Anglos started suppressing fire. If you're interested in this work, this year, it was published as part of the Archaeological Research Facility's work. publications at UC Berkeley, and it's free in PDF form. If you want to get a book form, it costs money. But you can look at their website and you can learn a lot. I certainly did by working with my colleagues. Okay. So I'm still in the lab after all those years, although I'm bringing that to a close in the next year or so. I saw this project as a fitting endpoint for me in a career that began with that conflicted consciousness. And archaeology's, and this notion that archaeology was really complicit in a lot of indigenous expropriation and genocide in this country. And my colleague Sim Schneider, a Coast Miwok and a student of Lightfoot, has written a really wonderful book about how archaeologists wrote Native Californians out of the Bay Area history. Even while the San Rafael journals were attesting to ongoing religious rituals by Miwok and other people in their county. Do we feel there's time to turn to current research? I'll do so really briefly. What I'm working on now, and I've just started, is a native diet and health, making archaeological data relevant to native concerns today. Now, it turns out that many, if not most, global populations can more quickly assimilate nourishment from seasonally available foods than can Europeans. And there's a long list here, including Native Americans. This is based on high levels of insulin production that are mobilized to break down food into glucose, with the surplus food to be turned into fat for use during the lean time as energy sources. And this physiology is so widespread that it suggests that it was the original human fat adaptation, and that Europeans are probably an outlier to the norm of the rest of the world's populations. Those people now forced to consume low-fiber, simple starches, and high-sugar diets year-round and blocked from access to traditional foods and also to the activities of obtaining and processing them tend to be very much more likely to develop metabolic syndrome, that triad of obesity, high blood pressure, and type 2 diabetes from an exhausted pancreas, than are people of European origin. And diabetes can lead to gestational diabetes, which before modern surgery and artificial insulin could kill both mother and child, heart attacks, strokes, glaucoma, and pancreatic cancer. My husband, who passed away in 2021, was Japanese American and had been troubled by obesity since his childhood and developed diabetes before he was 40. And he died of pancreatic cancer in 2021, as I said. So I know personally, and I read in the literature, 30% higher risk for people with type 2 diabetes. So that's part of the background that I'm looking at. But putting on fat is adaptive. It's not a genetic disorder, which medical doctors who are using Europeans as the norm think it is. Fat actually banks seasonally superabundant vitamins and essential fatty acids. That is, those fatty acids, they're absolutely foundational to human life, but that our bodies don't synthesize. And they can be stored in body fat and brought to bear when people need them in seasons when they're not available. Reproductive age women who in this area probably nurse their children for about 3 years need to be able to supply high levels of nutrients, including these, every day, year-round, for several years. So the fatter the better, because they're using it. Plus, women are working hard. They're gathering firewood, plants, what have you. They're preparing meals. They are not idle just because they're pregnant. In societies without refrigeration, and I saw this, Dasanach informants told me that it's better to get fat off of your sorghum before the bugs eat it. Because once it's on you, the bugs can't get to it. In cold climates, fat is insulating, and it's also a source of metabolic fuel when you're doing things like diving for abalones, which we know people were, or foraging in the subtidal zone in a very cold situation. So rich sources of EFAs in the food that we find in archaeological sites includes tarweed, which tiny, tiny seeds, but really, really high in EFAs. Hazelnuts, easier to process by far than acorns. Small schooling fishes, sardines, anchovies, silversides, and the marine birds and marine mammals that eat them. Those are all part of this food chain that carries the EFAs into human consumers. Now, the small schooling fishes can also be dried, and what we know is they were traded, and we find remains of small schooling fishes in archaeological sites that have been well recovered as much as 50 kilometers inland. So inland people wanted these foods too. Plus they're light. You can schlep a lot of them and trade them for stuff that you don't have. And children have especially high nutritional needs. Just contemplate the years of age and the calories they need to supply growth. And you understand, small wonder children are dying of famine in Gaza well before most adults do. And brain size within the first 5 years approaches adult size, which means that their brain growth requires EFAs as well as cholesterol and various vitamins and minerals. And the protein requirements in the first year of life are more than 2 times that of older infants and 4 times that of young adults. So children must consume EFA-rich plants and animals for bodily functions. And it's pregnant and nursing women who mobilize EFAs stored in their fat to build fetal brains and nervous systems via the placenta, and infant brains and nervous systems via nursing. Okay, let's look at some archaeological cases where we're asking, in reality, are what you would predict from the value of those kinds of foods played out in the archaeological collections that we have? And the answer is yes. I'm just going to look at fishes and then I'll be done. In the Quirosti territory up at Año Nuevo, the proportions of herrings and sardines and anchovies approaches 50% of all other fishes. And if we look at the Cotoni territory, just north of us, at SCR 10, which is pretty near the coast, herrings and New World silversides and anchovies are over 50% of the assemblage. At a later site, which is a good walk, a half-hour walk inland, still the fishes there have a near dominance of these, or a dominance of these small, oily, schooling fishes. So to sum up, the ancestral sites of Monterey Bay Native people show that they consume plants, marine fishes, seabirds, and marine mammals, and I could talk to you about the birds, that sustain their need for essential nutrients, supplementing these with protein from lean land mammals and starchy carbs from other seeds. Sources of EFA were selectively favored in all taxonomic categories that I've looked at, but I'm just beginning and I haven't done statistical tests and all that. Their diets covered their needs, and more importantly, those of their children more than adequately. They had a robust population when they were dragged into the missions, and 90% of them died there, I think, of malnutrition-based vulnerability to infections. Because I'm not even going to want to get into it, but the diet of people in the missions was designed by people that had no idea how to provision families to kill kids. And people did this while active and fit, while carrying extra weight or growing babies. And their lives were hard. They were strenuous. Those bones that were analyzed earlier of humans show that. But they were healthy. So I'm going to stop there and take any questions you have about this.
Thank you, Diane.
Barry.
So before asking questions, please get a microphone from the people that are... I think we have a question here, right?
What kind of birds did they eat?
Do you have microphones? Because the people online can't hear unless you talk on the microphone. Thank you.
I'm curious as what kind of birds they did eat.
They ate murres, they ate 2 species of cormorants, and they ate various kinds of diving ducks, grebes, and loons, all of which at least partly go after those same prey, small schooling fishes. And I would not really want to put any of them in the oven. And eat, because they would have been oily and taste like fish. But that's the main animals they were eating in the bird realm.
There's a question in the back. You can be seated while you answer. It's okay.
Diane, I really enjoyed what you have been saying. I just want to clarify one point. Earlier you made a comment about wine Deloria. I think I came into anthropology a little bit before you did.
You're going to have to...
People in my generation, when they started to work with Native Americans, they were affected by what Wine Deloria was doing. In particular, his article, Here Comes the Anthro, published in Playbook, because he wanted to draw public attention. And then his book, which you cited, Custer Died for Your Sin. So the question you raised of relevance towards the end, based on your own work, so that was really critical, because he thought that people like me, the ethnographers and cultural anthropologists who are working with them, what was the relevance of what the papers and books they were writing? While archaeologists were in a different category, because if you look at it from the southwestern perspective, Haje's work in Habiku, or Joe Bruce's work with Awatawi among the Hopis, were very useful to the people, because it provided employment to the people, and it also gave some evidence about their past here for a very long period of time. So the relevance was really quite critical. I shared several platforms with Wine Deloria in different contexts, and the point he was really making was his anger with people who are doing ethnographic research and general anthropological work, And he felt that there was no relevance of their work to the Native American life until the land claim cases started to be heard. And then the kind of testimony which anthropologists gave on behalf of the Native people, that was very critical for their success. So if you look at it in a historical perspective, you can see the relevance as well as irrelevance was really quite critical. I really enjoyed the evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Loki. You have a unique perspective, historically as well as personally. And yeah, I mean, the Zuni were some of the first people to actually consider that the archaeological work would support them, as well as, of course, the kind of ethnographic work that you did that supported their land claims later. So, you know, I am really, really happy. It's not 100% turnover in archaeology right now, but the fact that there is this consideration of working collaboratively. And, you know, there was a field school this summer that I helped teach in a little bit that was with the University of Oregon students, most of whom were white, and the Alma Mutsun Land Trust stewards who are Alma Mutsun, coming together and sharing weeks of work with Gabriel Sanchez and members of the Alma Mutsun tribe. Gabe and Alec Apodaca, who works for the Land Trust, are not themselves Native people, although they have Native ancestry that they acknowledge. But it's an interesting time in Americanist archaeology. Are there Zoom questions?
Yeah, one thing I forgot to mention, I'm sorry. Those of you on Zoom can ask questions on the chat. No?
We just have a comment. We have a comment that says, "Wonderful talk, Diane. Fascinating and beautifully constructed."
Although executed a little roughly. So, before you go, I thought I would I had all sorts of poems, but I will read you the one that sort of seems most apt for the moment. Some of you have heard this before. Putting away the bones. Putting away all these constant companions of 50 years. Deer, goat, sheep, cattle, coyote, puma, bear, dog, cat, chicken, gazelle, zebra, donkey, wildebeest, cormorant, hummingbird, duck, mouse, fur seal, wood rat, murre, back into their proper unmolested boxes and drawers. Only invisible fingerprints and DNA mark our long conversations. Now I finally close the boxes, the metal drawers, the cabinet doors, leaving the bones alone and quiet, and leaving me only with my own. Thanks for your patience and attendance. I am really so grateful, and just thank you.